To millions of wrestling fans in the 1980s, King Kong Bundy was the bald giant who demanded a 5 count and crushed opponents with his massive size. Weighing around 458 pounds, he became one of the most feared men in wrestling and even faced Hulk Hogan in the main event of Wrestlemania 2 inside a steel cage. But behind the monster character was Chris Pallies, a guy many wrestlers remembered as one of the funniest and most likable people in the locker room. Still, after years of grinding through the tough territorial wrestling system and working for promoters across the country, even someone like Bundy had his breaking points. And in this video, we are looking at 5 times King Kong Bundy snapped for real, moments when the line between the character and the man completely disappeared. But before we get to any of that, you need to understand something about who King Kong Bundy was and where he came from. Because without that context, none of these stories make sense. Christopher Allen Pallies was born on November 7, 1957, in Woodbury, New Jersey. His father, Donald, was a railroad freight agent. His mother, Margaret, worked as a department store clerk. This was a blue-collar family in every sense of the word. Working class. Honest. No shortcuts, no handouts. You earned what you got, and you did not complain about what you did not have. Young Chris was a big kid. Not just tall, but wide. Dense. Built like something designed to absorb impact and keep moving forward. He attended Washington Township High School in Sewell, New Jersey, where his brother Jeff wrestled on the school team and later became a 2-time Metro Conference champion at Glassboro State. Wrestling was in the family blood. After high school, Pallies found his way to the Monster Factory, run by Pretty Boy Larry Sharp. The Monster Factory was not some cushy training facility with padded rings and air conditioning. This was old-school professional wrestling education. You got stretched, you got beaten up. You learned to take a bump on a ring that felt like concrete, and you either survived or you found something else to do with your life. Pallies survived. More than that, he thrived. He debuted on March 7, 1981, wrestling for the World Wrestling Federation under the ring name Chris Kanyon. He was a jobber, the bottom of the totem pole. He got paid $50 to lose 3 matches at a television taping, and he was grateful for the opportunity. That was how you paid your dues in this business. You ate your losses, you kept your mouth shut, and you learned. In 1982, Pallies relocated to Texas, where Fritz von Erich and his family were running world-class championship wrestling. They developed him as Big Daddy Bundy, a combination of Shirley Crabtree's Big Daddy moniker and the surname of the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. He wore blue jeans with a rope belt and worked as a fan favorite. But then came a dispute with the Von Erich family, and legendary manager Playboy Gary Hart stepped in to transform him. The Big Daddy portion of his name was replaced by King Kong. The blue jeans were replaced by a black singlet. The smiling baby face was replaced by a scowling, terrifying monster heel. King Kong Bundy was born. He lost his hair during a feud with the Von Erichs, which only added to his intimidating appearance. He retired Fritz von Erich in Fritz's retirement match at Texas Stadium in 1982. He traveled through the territories: AWA, NWA, Mid-South, where Bill Watts gave him the 5-count pin gimmick that would become his signature. He demanded that referees count to 5 instead of the usual 3 when he pinned his opponents, just to prove how thoroughly he had destroyed them. By the time Bundy arrived in the World Wrestling Federation in early 1985, he was a fully formed monster. He feuded with Andre the Giant, a feud that started when Bundy interfered in one of Andre's matches and delivered several devastating splashes that storyline-wise gave the Giant a broken sternum. The 2 massive men battled at Madison Square Garden in a match billed as the Colossal Jostle. He ambushed Hulk Hogan on Saturday night's main event, alongside Bobby Heenan, repeatedly giving Hogan avalanches and big splashes that left Hogan with severely bruised ribs. That angle set up the steel cage match at Wrestlemania 2 that would be the crowning moment of his career. The match took place in Los Angeles. It was the first steel cage match in WrestleMania history. Hogan won, but Bundy came closer to putting the Hulkster away for good than almost anyone had before. This was a man who had been everywhere, done everything, and earned the respect of every person in every locker room he had ever walked into. A man who had survived the most brutal era in professional wrestling history through a combination of size, toughness, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to back down from anyone or anything. So when King Kong Bundy snapped, people paid attention. Because they knew that behind the jokes and the laughter and the quick wit, there was 458 pounds of legitimately dangerous human being. And these are the 5 moments that proved it. Number 5. The New Orleans Fan Gauntlet. Working as a heel in the territorial days was not like working as a villain today. Today, fans understand that wrestling is entertainment. They cheer the bad guys, they wear their t-shirts, they appreciate the craft. But in the early 1980s, when King Kong Bundy was working for Bill Watts in Mid-South Wrestling, the fans genuinely hated the heels, and they were not shy about letting them know it. Bundy told this story himself in a recording session with his old trainer Larry Sharp, a series of tapes that were meant to be sold to fans under the name Hitting the Road, but were never officially released. The tapes were recorded in 1999 at a studio in Westville, New Jersey, and they capture Bundy in his element, telling stories with that razor-sharp wit and a delivery that could have made him a successful stand-up comedian, which, as it turns out, he actually did become later in life. Around 1983, Bundy was working regularly in New Orleans for the Mid-South Territory. Every week, he would drive to the building, park his car, and walk inside. Simple enough, except for one problem. There was a public apartment building right next to the venue, and the people who lived in that building had figured out that the wrestlers had to walk past them to get inside. Night after night, show after show, the residents of that apartment building would rain down abuse on King Kong Bundy as he walked from his car to the building. They would scream at him. They would curse at him. They would call him every name they could think of, and some they probably invented on the spot. And Bundy could not do a single thing about it, because his car was parked right there. If he responded, if he engaged with them in any way, they could damage his vehicle. And on a wrestler's salary in the early 1980s, a car was not something you could easily replace. So night after night, this 458-pound monster heel had to swallow his pride and take it. Just absorb the abuse like a human punching bag. The people in that apartment building had figured out the one scenario where King Kong Bundy was completely powerless, and they exploited it mercilessly. But then came the last night. Bundy was leaving the territory. He was done with Mid-South, done with New Orleans, and he was never coming back. And on that final night, as he walked out of the building and headed for his car, the usual crowd appeared. About 50 kids swarming around him, screaming and yelling and following him all the way to his vehicle. But this time, there was nothing holding Bundy back. No reason to keep quiet. No car to protect for next week because there was no next week. For the first time, after months of silently enduring the abuse, King Kong Bundy was free. And according to his own telling of the story, he let them know exactly what he thought of them. Every last one of them. Bundy told this story with a mixture of amusement and lingering frustration. Because the truth is, working heel took a genuine toll on performers in that era. You were not just playing a character for an hour of television. You were living that character every moment you were in public. And the fans did not distinguish between the man and the monster. To them, King Kong Bundy was not Chris Pallies playing a role. He was King Kong Bundy, period. And they treated him accordingly. The situation in New Orleans illustrated something important about the psychological toll of being a professional wrestling villain in the territorial days. These men did not have security details. They did not have tinted windows and private entrances. They parked in public lots and walked through public spaces and dealt with public hostility on a nightly basis. And a man like Bundy, who was 6'4" and 458 pounds and instantly recognizable, could not exactly blend into a crowd. He was a target everywhere he went. Every gas station, every restaurant, every parking lot, and he had to take it. Night after night after night of Bundy's career. But it was real. The frustration was real. The anger was real. And the relief of finally being able to express it, after months of forced silence, was absolutely real. Number 4. The backstage explosion at an independent show. After leaving the WWE for the final time in late 1995, King Kong Bundy spent the rest of his career working the independent circuit. He wrestled for dozens of small promotions across the northeastern United States, headlining shows in armories and fairgrounds and small arenas. He feuded with Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Doink the Clown, and Tom Brady. He won the AWA Superstars of Wrestling Heavyweight Championship from Johnny Stewart in Oshkosh, Wisconsin in 1999. He was still a draw, still a name that could sell tickets and put people in seats. But working the independent scene was a far cry from the glory days of the WWE. The money was less, the travel was harder, the venues were smaller, and not every promoter treated their talent with respect. In fact, some of them treated their talent like garbage, and King Kong Bundy, a man who had main-evented Wrestlemania, a man who had wrestled Hulk Hogan for the World Championship in front of tens of thousands of people, was not the kind of person who would tolerate being disrespected. At one particular independent show, Bundy was booked to lose to Hacksaw Jim Duggan in the main event. Now, losing a match was not the issue. Bundy understood the business. He had been in it for over 2 decades at that point. He knew how it worked. He knew that sometimes you went out there and you did the job and you shook the other guy's hand and you moved on. But something about this particular show pushed him over the edge. After the match, backstage, Bundy erupted. He voiced his unhappiness with the promotion in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. When a photographer approached him and asked to take his picture for the promotion's website, Bundy allegedly unleashed a torrent of insults and profanity at both the photographer and the promotion itself. This was not the fun-loving jokester that Bret Hart had traveled the roads with. This was not the guy who made everyone in the locker room laugh. This was a man who had dedicated his entire life to professional wrestling, who had sacrificed his body and his health for this business, and who felt that he was being treated with a level of disrespect that he simply could not tolerate. The details of exactly what triggered the outburst have never been fully documented, but the incident was notable enough to be recorded in multiple wrestling databases and historical accounts. King Kong Bundy, the easygoing comedian, the gentle giant who loved his cats and made everyone laugh, had reached a point where the frustration boiled over and the real emotions came pouring out. There is a broader context to this incident that matters. After Bundy left the WWE, the company did not exactly treat him well. In his own words from a shoot interview, an outside business once contacted the WWE about wanting to use Bundy in an advertisement. The WWE told them they did not have his contact information. This was a lie. The company was still sending Bundy royalty checks every few months to his home address. They simply chose not to share his information, seemingly out of spite. That kind of treatment year after year, from the company that had made him famous, would wear down anyone. And by the time Bundy was working the indie scene, enduring small-time promoters who treated him like just another body to fill a spot on the card, the accumulated frustration of years of disrespect had built up to a pressure that only needed the slightest trigger to explode. It was a reminder that beneath the humor and the charm, there was a man who cared deeply about this business and about being treated with dignity. And when that dignity was violated, the response was fierce. Number 3. The Bouncer Incident in Chicago. This story comes not from the wrestling business itself, but from the comedy world, and it is told not by a wrestler, but by one of the most successful comedians in Hollywood. Jeff Garlin, the co-star of Curb Your Enthusiasm, alongside Larry David, devoted a significant portion of his 2019 Netflix special, Our Man in Chicago, to telling this story. And it is one of the most vivid illustrations of King Kong Bundy's capacity for sudden, explosive physical action outside of a wrestling ring. In the 1980s, Garlin was a young stand-up comedian working the clubs in Chicago. One of his regular gigs was at a disco bar, the kind of place that stayed open late and attracted a colorful clientele. It was not a fancy establishment, it was a bar full of people who liked to drink and dance, and Garlin was the entertainment. On one particular early Sunday morning, Garlin was in the middle of his set when a drunken patron decided to cause trouble. Not just heckling, not just yelling from the back of the room. This man grabbed a large rubber phallus and charged at Garlin, apparently intent on attacking him with it. The comedian did the only sensible thing. He ran. Garlin scrambled around the bar, trying to put distance between himself and his attacker. And that is when he saw him, a giant bald man, the Bouncer. A figure so impossibly large that Garlin could barely process what he was looking at. Bundy moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He intercepted the attacker, grabbed him with those enormous hands, and physically threw the man out the front door and into the freezing Chicago winter. Then he calmly locked the door behind him. Garland was shaking. The whole thing had happened so fast that his brain was still trying to catch up with what his eyes had just witnessed. The bouncer walked over to him, checked if he was okay, and introduced himself. His name was Chris. Just Chris. Nothing more, nothing less. But Garland could not shake the feeling that this man looked familiar. Something about the size, the baldness, the way he moved. And when he finally asked, the bouncer revealed his identity. He was King Kong Bundy, the professional wrestler, the man who had wrestled Hulk Hogan at Wrestlemania. After the incident, the bar owner forced Garland to finish his set, because apparently the show must go on even after you have been chased around a bar by a man wielding a rubber weapon. And when Garland finally left, King Kong Bundy walked him all the way to his car. Because that was the kind of man Chris Pallies was. He would snap into action with terrifying speed and violence when the situation called for it, and then immediately revert to being one of the most considerate, thoughtful people you could ever hope to meet. Garland described the whole drive home as a surreal experience. He could not stop repeating it to himself. King Kong Bundy saved him. King Kong Bundy, the monster from Saturday morning television, had just thrown a man into the street like he weighed nothing, and then walked a comedian to his car like a gentleman. It was not a wrestling angle. It was not a scripted moment designed to sell tickets. It was real. The violence was real. The speed was real. The casual ease with which Bundy dispatched a grown man was absolutely real. And it served as a potent reminder that while the matches may have been predetermined, the man performing them was as legitimately dangerous as anyone who had ever stepped into a ring. What makes this story particularly interesting is what it reveals about Bundy's life outside of wrestling. Here was a man who had main evented WrestleMania, a man who had been on television in front of millions of people, and he was working the door at a Chicago disco bar to make ends meet. The wrestling business in the 1980s did not make millionaires out of everyone. The top guys like Hogan and Savage and Andre lived well, but the rest of the roster often had to supplement their income with side jobs. Bundy never complained about it publicly. He just showed up, did his job, and handled whatever came his way. Whether that meant wrestling Hulk Hogan in a steel cage or throwing a drunk man into the snow. Number 2. The referee gets legitimately crushed on Saturday night's main event. In November 1987, King Kong Bundy was in the middle of one of the most high-profile feuds of his career. He had defeated Hulk Hogan via countout on an episode of Saturday night's main event, setting up a rematch that would air on the next episode. This was primetime network television. Millions of people watching. The biggest stage in wrestling outside of WrestleMania itself. During the rematch, something went wrong. Something that was not in the script and was not supposed to happen. In the heat of the action, the referee found himself caught between Hulk Hogan and a charging King Kong Bundy. Now try to picture this for a moment. King Kong Bundy, all 458 pounds of him, running at full speed. Hulk Hogan, 300 pounds of muscle, coming from the other direction. And in between them, a referee who probably weighed about 180 pounds soaking wet. The impact was devastating. The referee was legitimately injured. Not kayfabe injured, not selling for the cameras. Actually, genuinely hurt. He had been caught in a collision between nearly 800 combined pounds of professional wrestler, and his body simply could not absorb that kind of force. The match itself would become best known for Andre the Giant's post-match attack on Hogan, which set the stage for their legendary encounter at WrestleMania 3's aftermath. But for the people who were there, for the people who saw the referee go down and stay down, the moment was a jarring reminder of just how dangerous professional wrestling could be. Especially when King Kong Bundy was involved. Bundy was not a graceful worker. He was not a technical marvel who could chain together holds and counters with precision timing. He was not a Bret Hart or a Ric Flair, men who could make it look like ballet in there. He was a 458-pound wrecking ball who moved through the ring with the force of a freight train. And when he hit something, whether it was his intended target or not, the impact was real. The physics of 458 pounds traveling at speed do not care about scripts or predetermined outcomes. They do not care about camera angles or storylines or what the finish is supposed to be. Force equals mass times acceleration, and when King Kong Bundy accelerated his 458-pound frame toward a target, the force that resulted was absolutely devastating. The referee incident was an accident. Nobody planned for it to happen. Nobody wanted it to happen. But it happened because King Kong Bundy brought a level of intensity and physical force to his work that was genuinely dangerous. He was not pulling his punches in there. He was not going at half speed. When King Kong Bundy charged, he charged with everything he had. And sometimes, the people around him paid the price. This was one of those moments where the carefully controlled world of professional wrestling broke down, and the raw, unscripted reality of what these men were doing to their bodies became impossible to ignore. King Kong Bundy did not snap in the traditional sense. He did not lose his temper or attack someone out of anger. But the intensity, the force, the sheer physical power that he brought into that ring was real. And on that night, it resulted in a man getting genuinely hurt. Number 1. The Little Beaver incident at WrestleMania 3. WrestleMania 3. The Pontiac Silverdome. March 29, 1987. Over 93,000 fans packed into the building for what many consider the greatest wrestling event ever held. This was the night Hulk Hogan body-slammed Andre the Giant. The night that professional wrestling proved it could fill a football stadium. The night that professional wrestling proved it could fill a football stadium. The night that changed the business forever. And somewhere on that card, sandwiched between the spectacle and the history, was a match that would haunt King Kong Bundy for the rest of his life. It was a mixed six-man tag team match. King Kong Bundy teamed with Little Person wrestlers Little Tokyo and Lord Littlebrook against Hillbilly Jim, the Haiti Kid, and Little Beaver. The concept was simple enough. A novelty match designed to give the crowd a break between the more serious bouts, a chance to laugh and have fun before the main event delivered its drama. But nothing about what happened was funny. Little Beaver was a legend in his own right. Born Lionel Giroux, he stood about 4'4" and had been working in professional wrestling for decades. He was experienced, he was tough for his size, and his role in the match was to be a pest, to annoy King Kong Bundy, to buzz around him like a fly that would not go away, getting under his skin until the big man finally lost his composure. And that is exactly what happened. Throughout the match, Little Beaver targeted Bundy relentlessly, pestering him, provoking him, doing everything he could to get a reaction from the 458-pound giant. The crowd loved it. The visual of this tiny man antagonizing this enormous monster was exactly the kind of spectacle that WrestleMania was built on. But then Bundy snapped. In the context of the match, in the storyline being told, King Kong Bundy had finally had enough. He grabbed Little Beaver and body slammed him to the mat. Then, he dropped a massive elbow across the smaller man's body. The crowd gasped. The referee immediately disqualified Bundy's team. Even his own tag partners turned against him, furious at what he had done. Now, this was a worked match. This was scripted. The body slam and the elbow were planned. But the question that has lingered for decades is just how much of Bundy's intensity in that moment was acting, and how much was something deeper. Because watching the footage, there is a rawness to it, a realness. The way Bundy moved, the force he applied, the look on his face, and what happened afterward tells you everything you need to know about how that moment affected the real Chris Pallies. When Little Beaver died in December 1995, 8 years after WrestleMania 3, King Kong Bundy was genuinely worried that he was partly to blame. He was concerned that the roughness of their encounter at the biggest show in wrestling history had contributed to the smaller man's death. This weighed on Bundy's conscience for years. He carried that guilt around with him like a stone in his chest, wondering if he had gone too far, wondering if his intensity in that match had caused lasting damage to a man who stood barely 4 feet tall. The actual cause of Little Beaver's death was emphysema. It had nothing to do with the WrestleMania match. But the fact that Bundy spent years blaming himself, years torturing himself over the possibility that he had hurt this man, reveals something profound about who Chris Pallies really was beneath the monster heel exterior. He cared, deeply, perhaps more than anyone realized. The man who played a heartless villain on television was, in reality, someone who could not live with the thought that he might have caused genuine harm to another human being. The character snapped at WrestleMania 3, but the man spent years dealing with the emotional consequences of that moment. And in the wrestling business of the 1980s, there was no one to talk to about that kind of thing. No sports psychologists, no counselors, No support system for a man carrying around the fear that he had accidentally hurt someone smaller and more vulnerable than himself. You just swallowed it and kept going. You taped up your boots and you got in the ring and you played the monster for another night. And then you lay awake in another hotel room wondering if you had gone too far. Bundy himself reflected on this match later in his career with a mixture of dark humor and genuine emotion. He told interviewers that the match got him on more television sports shows than probably anyone else at any WrestleMania. It was featured on Hall of Shame segments and blooper reels. The image of a 458-pound man body-slamming a 4'4" man became one of the most replayed moments in WrestleMania history. But behind the replays and the clip shows and the shocked reactions of commentators, there was a real moment of intensity that went beyond what was scripted. There was a real man who carried the weight of that moment for years. And there was a very real fear that the line between performance and genuine harm had been crossed in front of 93,000 people. That is why the WrestleMania 3 incident sits at number 1 on this list. Not because it was the most violent, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the moment where the snap was real in a way that transcended the usual boundaries of professional wrestling. It was real in the ring, where the intensity of the moment produced something more visceral than anyone had planned. And it was real in the years that followed, where Chris Pally's the man had to reckon with what King Kong Bundy the character had done. And there you have it, 5 moments where King Kong Bundy snapped for real. From enduring months of abuse from New Orleans fans before finally letting loose on his last night in town, to exploding backstage at an independent promotion that had pushed him past his breaking point, from throwing a drunken attacker into the frozen Chicago streets while moonlighting as a bar bouncer, to legitimately crushing a referee between himself and Hulk Hogan on national television. And finally, to the WrestleMania 3 body slam that haunted him for the rest of his life. What becomes clear when you look at all 5 of these incidents together is that King Kong Bundy's snapping points were not random. They were not the actions of an unstable man who could not control himself. Every single one of these moments came from a specific place. Frustration at being disrespected, anger at being treated as less than he was worth, a protective instinct towards someone who needed help, the raw physicality of a man who simply could not moderate his own enormous power, and, perhaps most poignantly, the emotional weight of realizing that his intensity might have caused real harm to someone who did not deserve it. Chris Pally's was a complicated man living inside a simple character. King Kong Bundy was a monster, a villain, a one-dimensional wrecking machine designed to be feared and hated and eventually defeated by the hero. But the man wearing the black singlet was so much more than that. He was a comedian who could make an entire locker room double over with laughter. He was a friend who would walk a stranger to his car in the middle of the night. He was a colleague who earned the respect of legends like Bret Hart, Andre the Giant, and Hulk Hogan. And he was a human being who could be haunted by the fear that he had hurt someone. In his own way, King Kong Bundy had a code, a set of principles that he lived by and defended with the full force of his considerable presence. Respect the business, respect the people in it, earn your spot, pay your dues, and never, ever mistake the character for the man. Because the character might be a monster. But the man was something far more complex, far more interesting, and far more human than any wrestling storyline could ever capture. Bret Hart wrote about traveling with Bundy in his autobiography, describing him as a bald, 6'4", 450-pound monster who was built like an egg on 2 sturdy legs. Hart and his wife even nicknamed their son Dallas Little Bundy because the baby was husky and bald, just like the big man. That is the kind of affection that Bundy inspired in the people who knew him. Not fear, not intimidation, genuine warmth and fondness. Hart also described how he would goad Bundy and the Anvil into having impromptu sumo wrestling matches in the locker room. On one memorable night in Phoenix, the Anvil made the mistake of challenging Bundy while he was fresh out of the shower, barefoot, soaking wet, and completely naked. Bundy, still in his full ring gear from a match he had just finished, slammed the sizable The Anvil against the wall with ease. It was an achievement that Bundy never let his friend live down. For years afterward, he would bring it up at every opportunity, needling the Anvil about the time he got tossed around by a man while he was stark naked and dripping wet. That was the real King Kong Bundy. Not the monster, Not the villain. The guy who loved to laugh. The guy who loved to make other people laugh. The guy who could body slam you through a wall and then spend the next decade cheerfully reminding you about it. He was also a man who loved cats. At the time of his death, he had about 10 of them. Think about that for a second. One of the most fearsome characters in wrestling history, a man who terrified audiences for the better part of 2 decades, spent his quiet evenings at home surrounded by a small army of house cats. If that does not tell you everything you need to know about the gap between King Kong Bundy and Chris Pallies, nothing will. Bundy died on March 4, 2019, at his home in Glassboro, New Jersey. He was 61 years old. The cause was complications from diabetes. He had been scheduled to appear at WrestleCon in New York City the following month. His final tweet, sent just hours before his death, was promoting that appearance. He was still working, still showing up, still connecting with the fans who had watched him on television 3 decades earlier. His friend and promoter David Harrow posted on Facebook that day with words that cut through the noise of the wrestling world like a knife. Today, we lost a legend and a man I consider family. Rest in peace, Chris. We love you. Thank you for believing in me. The wrestling business has changed enormously since King Kong Bundy's heyday. The territories are gone. The kayfabe is dead. The locker room culture that produced men like Bundy, men who could be simultaneously terrifying and hilarious, hard as nails and soft as butter, has largely disappeared. Everything is more corporate now, more controlled, more sanitized. But every once in a while, when the old-timers gather at conventions and reunions and fan events, someone tells a Bundy story, and the room lights up. Because those stories are not just about wrestling. They are about a man who lived large in every sense of the word. A man who could snap when pushed too far, but who spent the overwhelming majority of his time making the world a funnier, warmer, more entertaining place. They do not make them like King Kong Bundy anymore. And maybe that is for the best. Maybe the wrestling business has evolved past the point where a 458-pound monster heel needs to moonlight as a bar bouncer in Chicago or endure months of abuse from apartment building residents in New Orleans. Maybe the days of men snapping for real and living with the consequences are behind us. But it is also a less colorful world without men like Chris Pallies in it. A world with fewer stories that make you lean forward and say, wait, that really happened. Fewer moments where the impossible becomes possible and the line between the character and the man disappears entirely. King Kong Bundy demanded a 5 count because a 3 count was not good enough. And in the end, that might be the most fitting metaphor for his entire life. He was more than what the standard measure could contain. More complex, more fascinating, more human, and far, far more real than most people ever realized. The wrestling world lost Chris Pallies far too soon. 61 years is not enough time for a man who had so many more stories to tell, so many more jokes to crack, so many more locker rooms to light up with that sharp, irreverent humor that made him beloved by everyone who knew him. In 2016, he had joined a class action lawsuit against WWE, alleging long-term neurological injuries from his years in the ring. The suit was ultimately dismissed, but it spoke to the price that men like Bundy paid for entertaining us. The bumps, the impacts, the years of putting their bodies through punishment that no human frame was designed to endure. He never made it into the WWE Hall of Fame. Some have speculated that his involvement in the lawsuit prevented that from happening. And that is a shame. Because King Kong Bundy belongs in any conversation about the men who made professional wrestling what it is today. Not because he was the most technically skilled, not because he held the most championships, but because he was real. In a business built on illusion and performance and carefully crafted personas, Chris Pallies was one of the most genuinely real human beings to ever lace up a pair of boots. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.